Okay, welcome everybody. We're going back to our Tuesday mornings with Maimonides after our little break for the JLI. So I guess we'll do it again till at least another month and a half to the next JLI. So we were talking about we began. We learned a few sections of Maimonides and the laws of, he calls it the laws of Shchenim, the laws of neighbors, and it governs how people interact with their neighbors. And that's more specifically, but more broadly, it's about really partnerships, because by definition, if you're a neighbor, you're a partner, because there's going to be some common ground that you share. Even if you don't like your neighbor, in some sense, your neighbor affects you, right? Your neighbor decides to plant a tree, your neighbor decides to put up a fence. Whatever happens in your neighbor's property at some point affects you. So that's the big idea, big picture that we have to discuss. And one of the things that we began with, just to summarize very quickly, is the concept of how do I separate a partnership? And we discussed this in the past classes, that in American law, it's not so simple to break up a partnership unless there's an exit strategy within your contract. But if we're in a partnership and at one point one person wants to separate, and unilaterally, that's not an easy thing to do. And even if finally the court will allow you to separate unilaterally, then you have to, how do you determine the value? In many cases, the only way to actually determine the value is to liquidate the business. And in other words, to sell. And that's obviously not always desirable. The Torah likes partnerships. I think, doesn't say so explicitly, but I think it likes partnerships. What you do see is that it's relatively easy to get out of a partnership. And if it's something that's easily divisible, for example, we partner with money, we could just separate the money, split the money. If we have whatever 100 pounds of grain, we could split that. Easily divisible, not a problem. The problem is if it's something that's not easily divisible. In other words, it's not even clear if it can't be divided. So now we have to sell it. One person has to sell out their stake in ownership. So the question becomes, how do I determine what the value is? Now we all know that the only way to determine is the marketplace. So I think my house is worth whatever it's worth. It's not, I don't know that for sure until I actually sell it. So how are you going to determine what the price of something is on the market if you can sell? So here we have a Talmudic approach, and it's a fascinating approach. And the Aramaic is gudoi igud. We discussed this at length. It basically means one partner tells the other, either you sell me your half at this price, or I will buy out your half at the same price. And it's your choice. In other words, if I want to break the partnership, I come to you and I say, either you give me your share for $50, or you can buy my share for $50. And because I'm giving you the choice, that's the check that the price is going to be reasonable. Because if I give you a price that's too high, if it's worth 50 and I say 100, then what you're going to do is you're going to sell your house, your half, and make a profit. If I give you a price that's too low, you will buy me out. So in that sense, that's a very elegant way of very quickly determining the price of an object. If it's hard to if it's impossible to separate, but it has to be sold. So that's the beginning. That was the beginning of the first chapter of the Shchenim, of the laws of relatives. So now we can make a little bit of progress. We could move in a little bit further. Okay, so let's see if I can share the screen. Why is my Zoom share? I think you see the screen. I think the
Yes,
most
it works.
wonderful. Okay. 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 The third section is actually a little interesting here. Um, the reason why it's interesting is because it's a matter that it's not specified clearly in Maimonides, but it is debated. I'm sorry, what am I saying? It's not specified clearly in the Talmud, but it's a debate between Maimonides and other commentators, and Maimonides rules this way, but it's not a simple matter. Um, what was the premise, as we mentioned, just to summarize again very quickly? The premise is that if the Torah wants to allow for partnerships to break up. Okay, why? Not because we don't like partnerships, to the contrary. We want to encourage partnerships. The only way you can encourage partnerships if you realize that it's not so hard to get out. If it's impossible to get out, people are gonna hesitate before they go in. So therefore, the Torah says, okay, it's relatively easy to break out of a partnership, and the way we do it is if the partnership is something that's easily divisible, we'll just divide it. Like I said before, if I have 100 pounds of grain, I'll just divide it. You get 50, I get 50. If it's impossible to divide, if it's not simple to determine the price and to divide, then we have the system of guda yigud, where basically I name the price and I give you the choice to buy me out, or I'll buy you out at the same price, as we discussed. Now, so that was the principle we discussed earlier. We summarized and we discussed this in the past weeks. Now the question becomes, we know the Talmud says this. The question is, in what cases does the Talmud say this? And there's basically two choices. One choice would be as follows, that the Talmud is talking about a case where it wasn't really my choice whether or not to be your partner. How could I become your partner when it's not my choice to become your partner? So let's see if anyone can think of this. Trick question. How do I become your partner? Against my will. So the two classic examples is, first thing is if we both inherit something from a relative, right? So our relative passed away, then that leaves a piece of land, or either a home or a piece of real estate or anything else, or a cow or a donkey or a car, it doesn't matter. And now we both are partners in this object, or in this possession, but I don't like you. I don't want to be your partner. So that's one way where I can be, and not only that I don't like you, I never agreed to become your partner. Okay, so that is one scenario where I'm your partner against my will. Another case where I could be your partner against your will, without anybody dying, without an inheritance. If something was gifted to me, if something was gifted to me and to you together. So let's say there's some person who wants to give us a gift. So the person says, I have a piece of land and I happen to gift it to the two people I like, Mr. A and Mr. B. Happens to be that Mr. A and Mr. B don't like each other, but the gifter likes those two people. And now these two people who don't like each other are partners in an object. So this is a partnership that I'm in this partnership against my will. So it's clear that the Torah wants to allow me to get out of this partnership. And like I said, the Torah has a very easy way to get out of partnership and an easy way to determine the price, as we discussed. Okay. Now the question becomes, do I have a right to break out of a partnership if I willingly agreed to enter this partnership? What do I mean? So another thing that, as we will discuss, if not today, then in the future weeks, another big idea that's behind this whole concept of breaking up partnerships is the concept that we're going to discuss later, which is the right to privacy. The Talmud assumes that if you invade my property, if I don't have privacy, I am damaged. In other words, my usage of this land or my usage of this home is diminished by you intruding on my privacy and by me intruding on your privacy. And this is something that's considered a real right in the Talmud, and an invasion of privacy is actually considered damage. And there are many ramifications to this law, which again, I highlight this every time. It's a fascinating concept to understand. Even in the United States Constitution, it doesn't say the word privacy. It's implied from the Fourth Amendment, but it doesn't say clearly, it doesn't say it explicitly. The Talmud, going back thousands of years, tells me that if I look at your private domain, I am damaging you, and you have a right not to be damaged. Fascinating idea. So the point here is, let's say, what am I supposed to do if we both inherit somebody from a common relative, or we both get a gift from a from a friend, and the friend gifts it to both of us, and the friend says, both of you, I'm gifting my house to both of you. So we understand that you can't force me to remain in this house with you, because then we are both being damaged. How are we being damaged? Not only because I don't like you, that's a small point. Even if I do like you, I still need my privacy. And if we're talking about something that's not easily divisible, like a home, there has to be a way where I can get out. One of us can get out and break up this privacy and break up this partnership. And how do we do so? We gave that example again, gudai igud. I come to you and I say, look, either you buy out my half at this price, or I buy out your half at the same price, and I give you the choice. And we discussed at great length why that would keep the price as fair as possible. So it's clear that I can do that. I can protect my privacy and protect my right to privacy if I became a partner against my will. Okay. Now here comes an interesting question, and this question is not explicitly in the Talmud, but Maimonides addresses it. Maimonides sort of rules this on his own. He implies this from the Talmud. Other people disagree. Say I become a partner involuntarily, but I become a partner with you voluntarily. So for example, I come to you and I say, I have nowhere to live. I want to live in your house, and I'm willing to pay rent for part of your house, for the right to live in your house. And you agree. You draw up a contract. The contract says, I'm going to live in your house for the season, for the year 2021, and I'm going to pay you whatever I'm going to pay you. That's what now we're partners. Now the question becomes, so this is completely voluntary contract. When I agreed to move into your house and paying rent and renting part of your house, I knew I'm going to be your partner. And I knew that we're going to be sharing space together. And I knew that may be an invasion of my privacy. And yet I agreed contractually to this setup. Now the question becomes, can I come 2 months later after I signed a contract and say, you know something, I want out of this contract. Why do I want out of this contract? Because my privacy is being invaded. How am I going to get out of the contract? There's no one else to rent. It's the middle of the winter. Nobody moves in the winter. Well, I say, okay, my friend, either you buy out my contract for this price, or I'll buy out your share for that price, for the same price, and I'll live in the entire home. So this is a big question. When the Talmud says at any point I can break up a contract, I break up a partnership, and tell the other guy, either you buy me out or I buy you out, what are the parameters of this law? Does this law apply only to cases where I became your partner against my will, because either we inherited a house together, or we were gifted a house together? Or, and I'll tell you what Maimonides says, and here's what Maimonides says, and I'll share the screen now. Now Maimonides says this law applies, but the reason why I gave you the introduction to show you that this is a big deal. Not everybody agrees, but again, consistently, Maimonides takes the right to privacy to the extreme, even further than other commentators, and even further than the Talmud says so explicitly. So what the Talmud is going to say, even if I rent space together with someone else, in other words, I go into this partnership unknowingly, and I know that my privacy is going to be what's the word I'm looking for? Compromised in this scenario. Still, I have the right to back out at any point to protect my privacy. So this is a big deal, because again, it's not explicitly in the Talmud. This is Maimonides' interpretation of the Talmud, taking it further than other Rishonim, than other early commentators. So here we go. I want to read number 3. right? So I'm just going to scroll up for a second just to see the background. This is Shchenim, the laws of witness, the laws of neighbors, chapter 1. We're in the first section. If I'm not mistaken, there are 12 or 13 sections. So we're making a lot of progress. After a few weeks, we're in chapter 1, section 3. There's 13 chapters, 14 chapters. Okay, so we got time. This will keep us busy for a while. So I hope you have a lot of time. Okay, here we go. Number 3. When one person rents from a colleague a portion of a courtyard or a field that is not large enough to divide, or two people rent such a property in partnership. So we're talking about, we both rent a courtyard. A courtyard, it's interesting, it's important to understand what a courtyard is in the Talmudic times. Talmudic times, a courtyard is where you lived, where you did most of your, many of the functions that a person would do in their home today, in Talmudic times, you did in your courtyard, you did outside. So there was a fence around the yard, and that was your courtyard. That's what you did. Why? Because you're living, remember, the Talmud is in Babylonia. You're living in Iraq. And inside, it's, first of all, the homes were small. So what did you do in your house? In your house, you lived, you slept in your house. And when it rained, you went indoors. But for the most part, you'd rather do anything you can do outside, you'd rather do outside. So you ate your meals outside, you relaxed outside. A lot of what you did outside in the courtyard. So therefore, if I have two people in a courtyard, it's not like today where my neighbor sees my backyard. No, if someone else sees you in your backyard, they are really restricting what you could do, or they're restricting your psychological sense of privacy, which again, the Talmud takes very serious. So again, number 3 says, if I rent part of your courtyard, or I rent a part of a field that cannot be divided. We'll discuss basically field. If it's large enough, it's easy to divide. But if it's not large enough, we cannot divide this field. So therefore, now I rent a part of your field. What does that mean? It means we're going to work every day together. It means you're going to watch me plow and I'm going to watch you plow. It's like, imagine I go to your office and I settle in your cubicle or in your office. It's an invasion of privacy. There's nothing wrong, but a person has a right to privacy. So this is a case where I rented part of your courtyard, or I rent together with someone else. We rent a field, we rent a place in partnership. Here comes the big idea. Each one can compel his colleague and tell him, either rent my portion from me or rent me your portion. In other words, the Talmudic concept of being able to break up the partnership with this model of either buy me out at this price, or I'll buy you out at the same price, and give the other person the choice. It could be done even if we entered the partnership together. If the property is large enough to divide, it should be divided. As I said, this is a big deal. And we talked about this when we discussed Maimonides. We always want to keep an eye at a commentator called the Ravid. The Ravid is an acronym for Rabbi Avraham ben David. He was one of the greatest sages of the time. He was much older than Maimonides. And when Maimonides wrote his book, there was a lot of controversy, as we know. And the Ravid wrote comments on Maimonides. And in some places, he's very harsh. But when you read the Ravid, you think he didn't like Maimonides. But the reality is that the fact that the Ravid was commented on Maimonides, and the Ravid with his stature, so because he commented on the book of Maimonides, that was an endorsement of the book. Because that would mean that wherever he does not disagree with Maimonides, he does agree, and that was a big endorsement. And even so the Ravid was a big endorsement for Maimonides, and he respected Maimonides, and therefore don't get turned off when he speaks very sharp against Maimonides. So I'm just going to give you an example on this comment on number 3. The Ravid says, Amar Avraham says, his name was Avraham, Rabbi Avraham ben David. He says, this law, Nafshay Ibsavayas. This is a quote from the Bible. He says, this law, Maimonides, he made this up. It's very poetic. It's from the book of Job. His soul desired, and he made it up. In other words, he's saying Maimonides made this law up, because he says this does not apply to renting something together, because when it comes to renting, and maybe even to purchasing, we can discuss that. If you knowingly went into the partnership, you can't break it up. So what's the Talmud talking about, says Ravid? The Ravid says that the Talmudic law applies only to a case where only to a case where I'm in a partnership with you against my will. For example, two siblings rent something from, inherit something together, or something is gifted to two people. But the Ravid says this does not apply to a rental property where someone goes into contractually, knowingly goes into a partnership. He can't back out later. Again, I'm just bringing the Ravid to explain how, I don't want to say radical, but extreme Maimonides is, how extreme he takes the concept of privacy. Even if I agree, and I agree knowingly to enter a partnership with you, at any point, any of us can break the partnership. Break the partnership means force the other one to buy out their contract, or they will buy out the other party. Why? Because the right to privacy is so important. So this is the first idea I want to dwell on, and that's the first big idea. If anybody has any comments, please share. Otherwise, we'll continue, and hopefully hopefully we'll get a little lighter as we go along until we get to the next big idea. Okay.
I had a question, Rabbi. So the reason for that, for Maimonides, is maybe we are willingly entering the contract or renting, but we may not know each other's character. And then later on, when it becomes apparent that my privacy is severely compromised, or I cannot stand that person, and that's probably the reason.
Yes, that's one reason. There's a few opinions of what the reason of Maimonides is. I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to add additional layers. But one of those reasons from a sage named the Rashba, and he was also of early. He's lived a little bit after Maimonides, one of the great Talmudic interpreters. He's called a Rishon, the early commentators like Rashi, like Rambam, and the Rashba says exactly what Vicky says. The Rashba says, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Aravid, what are you saying? You're saying I agree to live with this person to be a partner with, to live in this person in the same home, or to live together with this person in the same courtyard, or to rent, to go to work with this person in the same field. Therefore, now you're telling me that I'm stuck with this person." I could always say, I didn't realize how terrible of a person this guy is. Who would have known the person is such an idiot, right? So that's what Vicky said is what the Rashba says. The Rashba says, I can always say, I didn't realize how hard it is to live with the other person. I thought the person's a nice person. Once I moved in with him, oh my God, it's terrible. I have to be able to leave. So Maimonides protects that person's right to leave, but again, to leave without a loss. You can always break your contract and just take a loss. Here, you're not taking a loss because you can force the other person to buy you out as long as you are willing to buy them out, to buy out their half of the contract. If they don't want to buy your half, they have to be willing to sell their half. And that's the whole, this idea that we have to keep going back to it, because that's the foundation of all these laws, is the model through which we can break up a partnership with, as best as we can, protecting the rights of both parties. So that's very good, Vicky, spot on. That's what the Rashba says. Other people say something a little bit more complex. I don't want to get into that right now, but what you're saying is the Rashba. You know what? I'll put it out here. The other people say, the guy could say, why did I buy? Because I knew the Talmudic principle that at any point you can leave. So I never really agreed to give up my right to privacy. In other words, the first opinion says, what Vicky said is, what the Rashba says is, I could say, let's say I rent space from your house. I say, you know what, I want to move into your house. I'll pay you this amount of money for this season. So you let me in. Then I say, buy out my contract, or let me buy out your half, because I can't live with you. But you said, but you agreed. So the first answer is what Vicky said. The first answer is I can come back and say, look, I agreed to live with you, but I didn't realize how hard it's going to be. Who would have known you're such a slob, right? Okay, that's the first interpretation. Second interpretation is I could say, look, I never even agreed to give up my right to privacy. So why did I sign the contract? Because I know that Judaism is so protective of the right to privacy that I know that I'll be able to leave whenever I want. So in other words, according to the second opinion, the reason why it's not a commitment is because I'm cognizant of the Talmudic right to leave whenever I want and either buy you out or have you buy me out. So those are the two reasons that are brought to explain Maimonides' point. But again, talk about the big picture. The Talmud says a law that you can break out of a partnership because of the right to privacy. The Talmud, we're not sure if to apply the Talmud narrowly or broadly. So the Ravid and others, the Ravid says you apply this narrowly. You only apply it in specific cases, in cases where I became your partner against my will. But the Ravid argues that this principle cannot be applied broadly. You can't say, anytime I go into a partnership, I'm allowed to get out. That's what the Ravid says. Maimonides says, no, I'm applying this as broadly as possible. In any case, I can get out because I say, I can't, the other person is invading my privacy. I can't live like this. And the halacha, the ruling follows Maimonides, interestingly. So the ruling follows Maimonides, and consistently, Judaism is very protective over privacy, which is very interesting because you don't expect religion to be so protective of the privacy, because there's always an attitude, if you're not doing anything wrong, why are you afraid of invasion of privacy? But Judaism believes no, privacy is critically important, not only as a legal right but also psychologically. And there's also mystical reasons for this, that there's the idea for a person to be healthy, you have to have both chesed and gvura, both the ability to express and the ability to withhold. There's two important functions in a person's life. I have to have self-expression. If you, what's the word I'm looking for? If you suppress my right to express myself freely, that's terrible oppression, right? That's like oppressive societies. But on the other hand, if you don't, because I want to express myself, I want to share. But on the other hand, part of my soul doesn't want to share. Part of my soul wants to be private. And that's the gevura. Chesed is expressing and gevura is holding back. And the human soul needs both those aspects to be healthy. Why? Because God has those aspects. Do you want to go mystically? Where do you get that from? God creates the world. That's creative power. That's self-expression. But the world would not be able to be created if God did not hold back his infinite light and give room for creation. So going back to God, which is the source of everything, you have these two energies, the energy of expression and the energy of holding back, not to express, to be within myself. And that's the origin of the creation. And therefore, it's no surprise that who are a reflection of God's energy, we too have those two elements within ourselves. On one hand, we want to express, and if you rob me of my right to express myself, it's totally oppressive. But by the same token, we also, like God, want the right to conceal, to be alone, to be the self and not to expand. And that's the right of privacy. So in addition to a legal argument, it's also a mystical argument from the perspective of Judaism. Okay, enough about the Kabbalah. You came here for law. You're going to say, look, you're going to say I was cheated out of its false advertising. I want to learn law, not Kabbalah. Kabbalah would come back on Friday. Okay, so we'll do a little bit more law.
Just for the record, nobody's complaining, Rabbi.
No, I'm just kidding. I just have to make a joke. Otherwise, to make some jokes. Otherwise, people are gonna be disappointed. Once in a while, I need a joke. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with one point. We have a few minutes left to conclude one point. This is not a very heavy point, so we could sort of relax. But it's going to be, we keep saying about something that's easily divisible. So Maimonides wants to define, what does it mean something is divisible? And he has a very interesting definition. Remember, it's a law. So everything has to have definition. So let's read the definition. So I'm going to read 4. He brings the definition, and he brings all kinds of examples, the way from life, the way it was in Talmudic times in Israel and in Babylonia. So that's less important. What's more important is the underlying principle. So here we go. Number 4. What is meant by a property being large enough to divide? And again, if it's large enough to divide, then I come to you and I say, we're splitting. If it's not large enough to divide, then I say, either buy me out or I'll buy you out at this specific price. In other words, either you buy me out at this price or I buy you out at this price. But if it's large enough to be divided, I can't do that. I just divide it. So what's the definition? How do you define something that's large enough to divide? So the answer that everything we need the definition. You have a very straightforward formula. Here is the formula. Can be boiled down to one sentence. That's law. You want to boil down complex principles into simple sentences. So this is the formula. That if it were divided among partners, even the partner with the smallest share would receive a portion of the property large enough to be referred to by the same name that is used to refer the entire entity. Okay, this is complicated, and it's 3 lines long. In Hebrew, it's 1.5 lines long, so it's not as complex. If you divide something and each half has the same name as the whole, that's considered it's big enough to divide. What do I mean? I mean that if you want, let's talk about a courtyard. A courtyard. Maimonides says if something is smaller than 4 cubits by 4 cubits, it's not a courtyard, right? If you want to rent an apartment, if you want to rent a house, and you look at the features and it says we have a front yard, and you show up, and in front of the house there's 2 feet by 2 feet, you're going to say, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's no front yard here. They're going to say, well, we have a little strip of grass. That's not a front yard. That's just 2 feet by 2 feet. That's not considered a front yard. Okay. So Maimonides says if it's not 4 feet by 4 feet, it's not a front yard. It's not a yard. Now, so if the only way I could force my partner to divide my yard is if it's big enough that each half will be called a yard. Right? We have a yard. So in other words, it's going to have to be at least 8 square feet. And then when I split the yard in half, each one has 4. So 4 is still considered a yard. Okay. But if this yard is only 6 feet, if this yard is only 6 feet by 6 feet, if we split it in half, then each section is not called a yard. So if it's not called a yard, it cannot be split. That's about a yard. And we're going to do the same thing about a field. And in field, it's different in Israel and Babylonia, but that's already details. That applies to the ancient world. It's not relevant to today. But the principle is still relevant today. The principle is that if something could be divided and each half retains the name that it had when it was whole, then it's big enough to be divided. For example, a field. The field has a minimum size. If it's too small, if it's a half an acre, it's not considered a field. So that's the point here. The point here is if something is big enough that if I divide, each half still retains the name of the object, still retains the name, and is considered in the same category that it was before the division, then it's big enough to divide, and then you can just divide it. So we'll read a few lines inside, and we'll see what he says, and that will be it for today. We'll finish in 2 minutes. Thank you for joining. It's always fun to get back to law. Here we go. Number 4. What is meant by a property being large enough to divide? That if it were divided among the partners, even the partner with the smallest share would receive a portion of the property large enough to be referred to by the same name that it used to refer to the entire entity. And we'll explain. Maimonides will explain. If, however, the name that is used to refer to the entire entity would not be used for this portion, it is not large enough to divide. And now he brings an example. What is implied? Whenever a courtyard does not contain 4 cubits by 4 cubits, it cannot be called a courtyard. Okay, you have a strip of grass that's 2 cubits by 2 cubits. It's wonderful. You can set up a barbecue on the 4th of July, but it's not called a courtyard. Whenever a field is not large enough to sow 9 kabim of grain, it is not considered to be a field. Whenever a garden is not large enough to sow a half a kav, it is not considered to be a garden. Whenever an orchard is not large enough to sow 3 kabim, it is not considered to be an orchard. It doesn't matter what these measurements are. You understand, in the ancient world, an orchard was a certain size. A vegetable garden was a certain size. It doesn't mean the size of the land. It means how many vegetables could you plant here. Okay, so these were the lists. Now we're going to say, therefore, a courtyard is not divided among partners unless it's large enough for each of the partners to receive at least 4 cubits by 4 cubits. In other words, if a courtyard is 8, then we can split it 4 by 4. If it's 6, it's too small, you can't split it, then you have a different option. You tell the other guy, buy me out or I'll buy you out. A field is not divided unless it is large enough for each of the partners to receive at least enough to sow 9 kabim. Right? Because 9 kabim is the minimum for a field. A garden is not divided unless it is large enough for each of the partners to receive at least enough to sow a half a kav, which is the minimum amount for a vegetable garden. And an orchard is not divided unless it is large enough for each of the partners to receive at least enough to sow 3 kavim, which is the minimum amount for an orchard. So this is the story in short, ladies and gentlemen. To summarize, we'll start with the end because that was easy, the easier half. The easier half is Maimonides. This defines how do you determine whether something could be divided or whether you use the other option to break the partnership by telling the other person, I'll buy you out at this amount or you buy me out at the same price. What's the definition of something large enough to be divided? If each half retains the name of the whole. So if it's called a vegetable garden, if each half could be referred to as a vegetable garden, then you could divide the vegetable garden, etc. The first idea we discussed is the concept that the Talmud says that I can break out of a partnership unilaterally by using one of these two methods, by using this method of telling the other person, naming the price and telling the other person, either buy me out at this price or I'll buy you out at this price. Says Maimonides, this applies broadly. It applies even to cases where I go into a partnership with somebody else voluntarily. That's what Maimonides says. As we mentioned, others say they study the law much more narrowly, and they say, no, it only applies to partnerships that you entered involuntarily. You just became the partner either by receiving a gift or by inheriting. They would argue that if you agreed to go into a partnership with somebody, you can't break it up just because you claim the right to privacy. But Maimonides takes it broadly and says, no, it applies to all cases. And it so happens to be that the Jewish law follows Maimonides in this case. So thank you very much. I hope this was somewhat interesting, and have a wonderful Hanukkah. And we will continue this Maimonides section of Maimonides, God willing, next Tuesday in good health, 10 a.m. Otherwise, we're back to the regular programming. Wednesday, the Haftorah. Thursday, the Parsha. Friday, Kabbalah. Hope to see you in good health.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.